Well, welcome to the show. This is Jamie McNichol coming to you from the Rocker Diaries. What an awesome show we got to you tonight. But first and foremost, I'd like to say what a crazy week it has been. Thank you to everyone that has listened to the Dave Evans episode. Got over 2,000 views on that. Amazing, amazing. And thank you to everyone that has shared it, from Blabbermouth to a fanzine in Mexico to a fanzine in France. It's just amazing. But more importantly, this is not about me. This is for you guys, the fans. Well, tonight, also, it's been a bit of crazy from the other things with the media things. Australia can't share any news from Australia, whether it's mainstream media news due to the pandemic, or more importantly, music news. Some of the magazines that I work with, we can't share our work on Facebook. Sorry, Facebook has deleted a lot of stuff, and we can't even see some of the news from the music world, like Blabbermouth and Metal Hammer and all that. We just can't see it. Facebook has blocked it. So we are going to talk a little bit about that in this episode with this awesome guest. He's written a lot of books, and I've got one of them. It's a bit of a show and tell. The Megadeth in Life with Death. He's a co-author in this one, and he's done many other books as well. Welcome to Joel McIver, all the way from the UK. How you going?
Hi, Jamie. Thanks very much for having me on.
Good, man. And thanks to J Double Promotions over in Western Australia. This is also a co-juncture production. And thanks, Jay, mate. And I need to give you a little bit of a slap, apparently. Nah, you're good, mate. You're all good. You're good. But Joel, man, you've done awesome writing in your work. But first and foremost, growing up as a kid, when was your first taste of rock or metal for you?
It's going to make you laugh, actually, Jamie. When I was growing up, all I listened to was, when I was a kid, I guess, it was the Beatles and Deep Purple and all the stuff that, if you're my age, which is 50, all the stuff that your parents listened to, right, in the 70s. Yeah. And then in the 80s, I got fully into the pop music of the day, I guess. So it was all about Soft Cell and Duran Duran and all that stuff. And I kept on listening to that. And I still do listen to a lot of stuff that isn't metal. And then a good friend of mine played me Metallica's Master of Puppets. Not till I was 17, actually. But I had this massive kind of like sudden change of attitude. I'd never really been that interested in metal before. I didn't really even go through a hard rock phase. I was talking to someone else about this recently. Most of us in this industry who write about the music that we do, you know, you get into Kiss and you get into Maiden and you get into Aerosmith, you know, and sort of hard rock, right? Zeppelin, Sabbath, before you get into metal. I didn't really do that. I went straight from listening to Duran Duran, I'm telling you, to listening to Slayer and Anthrax and Megadeth. And a couple of years later into the death metal stuff and then the black metal stuff. And to me, it was all just music with energy, you know, that moved you and gave you an adrenaline rush, just like a cool song by the Beatles would, you know, except it was faster and heavier and more evil. So that was my way in. But I guess it is slightly unusual because I didn't have a Van Halen phase that I went through, you know?
Yeah. Well, see, many people don't realise I am currently coming up to 42 years of age, and I've still got the baby face. And people say, Jamie, you're not 42. Yes, I am. I'm coming up to 42. But for me, when it came to music, my first taste of music was Barry Manilow playing.
Yeah, but all that stuff is great, man. The production of those 70s songs, the arrangements, the melodies, all that stuff stays with you for a lifetime. I'm a big fan of all that stuff.
Yeah. And then when I saw Kiss on Countdown here in Australia, when they first came to Australia, that just opened up. I mean, I was only one, but I can still remember it. I didn't know who the people were. I just saw a guy in women's makeup. That's all I remember.
Yeah.
But later on, I started to realize who they were, and the bands that you mentioned, like Metallica, Iron Maiden. I got an album around about 1989, 99. That's when things started to shift for me in music direction. I've got the album they released that year, and then I went back to the start and got all the other albums.
So that's what we do, isn't it? I remember, you know, I don't think I heard Maiden until they were on the Seventh Son tour. In fact, I saw them play at Donington that year in '88, and I heard that album and liked it. And it was only in subsequent years that I went back and discovered the previous catalogue.
Now, you're also a fan of the genre of that music, but when did you first started to realize that writing autobiographies or being a co-author, when did that dream eventuate for you at the beginning?
Yeah. So first, I was a teacher for a few years after I did my degree, with the aim of becoming a journalist, and that eventually happened in let me think, 1999 when I was 28. And I got a job on a magazine called Record Collector, which is super respected over here, super geeky, super all about collecting vinyl. It's a lot of fun, and I was on that mag for 6 years. But in the first year of that job, I suggested a book, my first book, to Omnibus Press, which is a publisher over here, and also in Sydney. They have a branch in Sydney. That book did well. The next book did well, and it kept. I started writing books, once, twice a year, as well as being a journalist full time. And then I had a big hit, a bestseller, I guess, with a book about Metallica in 2005, 2004, 2005, and because it did really well, I was able to jack in my job on Record Collector magazine. So to answer your question, first it was journalism, then it was writing books of my own, right? So my own biographies of bands, and then writing books with people, being their co-writer, if you like. Didn't happen till 2011, 2012, when I started working with Glenn Hughes on his autobiography. Now, Glenn was in Deep Purple, he was in Black Sabbath briefly, he's a solo artist, he was in Black Country Communion. Amazing singer, amazing bass player. And we spent a few years on that. And when that book did well, then the door opened to do co-writing gigs with other artists. So the David Ellefson book you just mentioned, that was the second one. Then it was Max Cavalera of Soulfly and previously of Sepultura. Then I did one with Glenn Matlock of the Sex Pistols. And then bands started asking me to do their official book. So I did a few of those. And then I sort of branched out a bit away from metal. And I did a book with Woody Woodmansey, who was David Bowie's drummer in The Spiders from Mars. And also with John Mayall, who was this blues legend, was and is this blues legend. And there's 3 or 4 more of those co-writes coming up in the next year or two. So I guess the Glenn Hughes book was the first co-write, and then I got known for doing that. And so the offers came in, and it's sort of stretching forward for the next few years. So I'm very fortunate. It's a lot of fun doing these books.
Before I ask you this other question, when I started doing radio podcasting, I started to listen to disc jock radio in the heyday when I was 8 or 9. Had a double cassette tape player, and I was taping the songs off the radio, but in between the songs, I will record my voice as a voiceover, and just to see if I can be a disc jockey, so to speak, because I've always listened to a truckload of interviews on radio or TV before the internet came along. And I said to myself at the age of 10, if I ever want to get into this type of work, how am I going to make this a unique and original? Because most journalists, I'm not saying you, but most journalists, when they interview bands, it's the same questions, the same answer, the same questions. And I said, I want to move away from that, because bands have been asked and artists have been asked the same questions probably thousands of times.
Right.
Importantly, when I interviewed Vinnie Paul before he passed away, everyone was asking him in interviews if they were going to be a Pantera reunion. I came straight to him and said, Vinnie, I've got one Pantera question, and no, it's not about the reunion, because I think it's dead and buried. You're getting the same answer all the time. So I just came out of left field. I said, Vinnie, is there ever a chance of re-releasing the 4 albums before Cowboys of Hell? Boom. Took him off guard. He's like, wow, thanks, man. I didn't expect this question. That's why I thought I've asked you, when you got into journalism and also writing books, how did you differ yourself away from all the questions that's been answered in the previous years?
It's a great question, because having done, 3,000 interviews or whatever it is now, you do easily find yourself falling into that trap and just asking the predictable questions. And then you can hear them as they give you their answer, giving a predictable answer that's got dust on it. They're not even thinking about it. They said it 20 times. So my approach has been simple. It's been to try and get away from questions about music and questions about what they do, and have a kind of personal in a one-to-one chat about life, and just see what comes up. So I like to ask people, especially super famous people, things like, if you stop work, would you be financially set for life, right? And are you good at what you do? And what makes you proudest? And what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Because these big questions, they put them on the back foot and they force them to think carefully about an answer. And it reveals truth about people. And in revealing truth, you're penetrating that kind of PR shield that a lot of these people develop over the years. We all do after a few interviews. We all end up answering the questions in the same way because it's easy. So that's what I try to do. So in the case of the books I've written, for example, the one with David Ellefson, we talked about life, but along the way, I just kept saying, so what made you proud this year? What could have been better? What you know, where did you excel this year? And then when later we talk about him becoming a father, I would say, so what is good fathering to you? Where have you done a good job? You know, where have you avoided the mistakes that your parents made? And stuff that is universal. It's not just about work, and it's not just about guitar strings, you know, and all the stuff that you do have to ask, the nuts and bolts. So the short answer to that question, Jamie, is to get deep into people's heads if you can and ask them the real questions that matter.
And that's exactly what I took on for this show, the Rocket Diaries, is get to not just talk about the music side of things. Yes, this is a music podcast, but life in general, how they were like growing up as a child and being an adult. And I know Dave Ellison was an addict himself and whatnot, and he got himself clean and sober. And it's the same as Dave Mustaine. Before we get into your books as well, I want to go back to the Metallica one. How deep could you go with Metallica? I know Cliff Burton passed away in the road bus accident, but wasn't long after you've written that book, Jason Newsted left the band around that time because the documentary, Some Kind of Monster, it was documenting what the band was going through. And there was a lot of personal issues with James Hetfield and Lars and all that. But how deep could you go into the Metallica camp and to write that book that made a masterpiece the way it is?
The answer is not very deep. And the reason for that is that it was an unauthorized book. So I didn't have access to them in order to ask that kind of question. It's a good book because it does take a very, very comprehensive analytical view. But it's definitely not the inside Metallica's brains book that I would like it to be, and that it would be now if I were doing a book with them now, right? What it was the first big Metallica book. That was what was important about that book. There have been other Metallica books subsequently that are as good or better, but mine was the first. There just happened not to be a proper big doorstopper sized book about Metallica, and that meant that I could go really deep into interviewing everyone really who'd ever worked with them. I had interviewed them a couple of times myself for magazines at that point, so I was able to use those interviews and refer to those. But the short answer is that it's a comprehensive, well-written, well-planned book, but it's not the in-depth psychological assessment that I would like to do now if I were working with them on their authorized book.
Especially if you want to do the Cliff Burton autobiography, if you ever want to do that.
Well, I did do a book about Cliff that did really well. In fact, it's probably my best-selling book. It was called To Live Is to Die, and that came out 10 years after the Metallica book. And as I'm sure you know, and that was the stars really aligned for that one, because people queued up to talk about Cliff. So although the band didn't want to get involved, which is totally fine because they've told that story 100 times, I spoke to Cliff's girlfriend, Corinne. I spoke to people in Trauma, the band he was in before Metallica. I tracked down his first guitar teacher, right, in Castro Valley, California. I mean, dozens and dozens of people who had never spoken on the record before. So I'm really, really proud of that one. And that tells the Metallica story in a different way, although obviously it cuts short, right, because Cliff died in 1986.
I know many people ask me, Jamie, you didn't ask me any Metallica questions. Well, I've got to flow with the flow. There's more than just Metallica that Joel worked for, because the one thing I like about it is that you've done a co-written one with Deep Purple. Do you want to talk to the audience about how did that come about with Deep Purple?
With Glenn Hughes?
Yeah, Glenn Hughes one, yeah.
Let me see. I had interviewed Glenn for Bass Guitar magazine where I was working at the time, and I just dropped his manager a line and said, "How about doing a book?" And it so happened that he had wanted to, so we got together, made some plans. It took a while to get the right publishing deal, but when we did get that, then we were good to go. So I think I interviewed Glenn. The way these things work, right? When you're quoted as the co-writer or co-author, you're really the author. You interview the person for whatever it takes. In my case, it's between 30 and 60 hours usually to get someone's life story down on your computer, and then you turn that into a book, which they then approve and make changes to, and then it goes off to the publisher and so on. You get a celebrity to do the forward, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a deep experience, and you bond with these people quite deeply. But it's as simple as that. You just agree to do a book together. And you agree a percentage split, or you can be paid a fee. Once the finances are sorted out, then you're good to go. I recommend it. It's a fun experience.
It is, because it's like putting the jigsaw puzzle all together into one big picture.
Exactly what it's like. Yeah.
It's like a painter. That first stroke of the brush on the canvas can do a million things. And the good thing about
actually, the analogy of a jigsaw is better than the analogy of being a painter, because if I was writing fiction, right? If I was writing a science fiction novel, then I would have a blank canvas in front of me, and then I would be able to paint it into the style I wanted. The way I view it is writing nonfiction is it's not an art. It's like a craft. So it's like building a beautiful piece of furniture or something like that, and getting every single step right, and really, really honing it and refining it and polishing it. And it's a skill. Whereas writing fiction, which I may do someday, is a wholly different thing, because there aren't the parameters that a non-fiction book has.
Now, you've done another book on Slipknot. Now, I know fans on this show will ask about Slipknot. How was that for you personally? Because that's in the new metal type of thing, if you want to call it, in that genre of music. Because fans see them just like Kiss, but they've got 9 members on the stage. Because I saw Kiss on the Soundwave Festival here, and I saw, wow, their stage presence looked like Psycho Circus from Kiss with a massive clown on the back of them. How do you think about that? I mean, Corey Taylor, he's just an awesome frontman, not just for Slipknot, but for Stone Sour as well. But those guys would have just been thrilled that you've written for them.
It's funny, isn't it? New metal, it's like a dirty word these days, isn't it? But it does define a sound very well, from Korn and Cold Chamber through to Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park and Disturbed and even System of a Down and so on and so on. And I did the first book I did was about extreme metal. The second one was biography of Slipknot, which did well and was updated subsequently many times. And then I did a book about new metal. So I came up as an author while that music was happening. And then later on, I moved away from that, thank God, as the whole world did. But now what's interesting is that 20 years later, Jamie, I'm starting to enjoy that music again. I'm not saying I listen to all of Limp Bizkit's records on a front to back on a daily basis, but I will say that of that lot, Slipknot really, really transcended that niche. You wouldn't call what they do now anything like new metal, right? That was really just the first record. It's super, super heavy modern metal with a really, really dark lyrical twist and a dark imagery. The comparison you make to Kiss is perfect, because the visual aspect of the band was so important. But unlike a lot of bands that just have an image and nothing else, Slipknot actually have songs to back that up, despite what people say. Now, I was that thrash metal snob in 1999 and 2000 who said, "Oh no, I'm not listening to this. This isn't Slayer. This is not Anthrax. It's not Morbid Angel. It's not Deicide." I was that snob. And then as time passed and I listened to the stuff and I realized actually there's something here, the stuff is catchy as hell. And now I have a 14-year-old son who loves Slipknot, right? and he's fully on board with the look, the lyrics, all the songs, knows them inside out and backwards, follows them all on Instagram. And I think had I been 14 when I had come across Slipknot for the first time, I'm sure I would have been the same. The only difference, but I was 30, right, or 28 or something. So I was way beyond being impressed by that stuff. But now, and I keep reiterating this, now, all these years later, they're still going. They're still selling out stadiums and arenas. I saw them. The last gig I saw before lockdown was Slipknot a year ago at Wembley Arena. Was it Wembley or was it the O2? I can't remember. With in London with Behemoth supporting, and it was an amazing show. Like I went there with my son and we sat there and our minds were blown. And they're doing it. They're still doing it. You know, who else is doing it? No one.
No. Well, see, in 2019, Slipknot was supposed to do a double headline tour with Metallica here for Australia, but James Hetfield went back to rehab.
Yeah, to rehab, didn't he? Yeah. And in fact, that tells you something about the size of Metallica, that they can take out Slipknot as the support band, right? You know, that is hilarious to me, because the biggest metal bands now are Metallica, Maiden, and Slipknot, and there's no one else unless you possibly argue Rammstein, who are massive in Germany, are that big.
We say Judas Priest are still big.
Oh no, they're a big old band, but they're not as big as Metallica or Slipknot or Maiden.
Maybe Foo Fighters will be a
sure, but I think of them as a rock band, you know, not as a metal band. Yeah. Exactly. Oh yeah, there are bigger bands in the world than Metallica, right? Look at the Rolling Stones, U2, Coldplay, all that stuff. And then in America, you've got all the country artists, haven't you? Who are just massive country music. You know, the kind of new country is so huge there that they dwarf Metallica and Iron Maiden. You know.
Well, you mentioned about the '90s era, how you become a bit of an aggressor, not listening to that type of music in the late '90s. Yeah. It's exactly the same thing that happened to me. It was exactly the same. I remember back around about 96, 97, I was angry with the music that was coming out that I did not like. And it was like everyone was wearing Slipknot shirts or Limp Bizkit and all that. And I'm saying, what is this garbage? Because it was just like a mashed fruit salad for me. It just didn't make any sense. But later on in life, I realized there was other bands that I didn't explore, like Edguy and Hammerfall, Ice Earth, all those type of bands that were flourishing throughout not just the US and England, but throughout Europe. I'm saying, why haven't I listened to this stuff? And then going back to listen to like Korn and Limp Bizkit and all of that, and it's like, yeah, I won't listen to them all the time, but I'll still give them a listen. And
I think you become a little bit more tolerant, don't you, as the years passed? I mean, power metal was never really my thing because it was too cheerful for me. But at the same time, you know, there are some good songs there, and you can't deny the musicianship. But time passes, and you get less worried about all this stuff. The Metallica book I really went in hard into the records they did in the '90s, Load, Reload, and Saint Anger, and that was a 30-year-old writing, not a 50-year-old, if you know what I mean. And nowadays I'd be much more tolerant, I think, you know, because all you can do when you're an artist is what seems right at the time. And the only reason you ever regret anything is if you made a decision that you knew was wrong. I think that's what we all regret. If you do what you felt was right, then that's all you can do. And that's what they did, even if the results weren't that great.
And here's the major thing that I always have not an argument, but I get this coming from the Metallica fan. Anything before Justice for All, that is Metallica. Anything after that, we don't want to know you.
I was that guy. It's tragic.
And the question I want to ask you, do you still see it now that fans seem to put that band into a pigeonhole? They only go up to a certain point, and then that is it. Anything after that, well, if an original member leaves the band, they don't even acknowledge the new generation of the band.
On a constant basis, Jamie, I see this. And it's interesting because it reveals a lot about us as fans of heavy metal. The audience primarily is made up of sensitive people, mostly male, not all male, but mostly sensitive, you know, boys, really. And And we were all that kid. And when you are that kid at the time, you're very possessive and very careful about what you have and what you own and what you invest your emotion in. And I think a lot of people did that with those early Metallica records, and then felt a bit betrayed when they changed their style completely without checking with them first, you know. Yeah. And but again, so with the benefit of maturity, you realize that you don't need to be so anal about it, you know, and people are free to experiment as they wish.
You mentioned at the start as well with David Bowie, the memoir of him in that book.
His drummer.
Because David Bowie was regarded as probably an icon in the UK music world, if not around the world. Yeah. And then the Ziggy Stardust era, that just blows people away. How was it important for you just to write that book about such an icon of David Bowie?
It was important to me for a couple of reasons. I had been wanting to move away from endless metal. You know, I'd done, 25 books on metal by then. And I still love the stuff, and I always will, but there's more to life than that, right? And when the opportunity, so that the guy's name is Woody Woodmansey, right? He was this drummer, and played on the 3 or 4 of those albums, you know, including Aladdin Sane and Ziggy. And when the opportunity came up to interview him for a drum magazine, which I did, I thought this would make an amazing autobiography, and it did. And what was crazy was that while we were doing this, Bowie himself died, leaving Woody as the only surviving member of the Spiders from Mars, because Trevor Bolder, the bass player, had died, and Mick Ronson, the guitarist, had died, and then Bowie had died. So there was a great deal of interest around that book, and the pressure was on us. Not pressure, but our duty was to tell the story of what it was like to live with David Bowie in as accurate and as truthful a manner as we could, because quite often you forget that what we're doing here is recording our culture, the details of our culture for posterity. That's what we're actually doing. It's the same with your podcast. These things will be available for people to listen to and learn from when you and I are dust, right? So what we did, my approach with Woody Woodmansey was not necessarily to look at the big brushstrokes of David Bowie's career and say, what were the seismic changes that accompanied Aladdin Sane? I was interested in that, but I was also interested in the small details. Like, so what was it like when David Bowie went down and bought the chips from the shop near the house you lived in? What was it like when you walked downstairs in the morning and David Bowie and his wife Angie were making a cup of tea for you? Those kind of mundane almost details that bring the reader close to the reality of what it was like. I think those things are important. So that was my approach, and it was important to do that because I wanted people to understand that Bowie wasn't like some god. He was just a guy like the rest of us, just a very artistic one.
Yeah. And just so heartfelt that when David Bowie recorded his last album, he knew that was going to be it. He knew. And especially that last single that got released, you can tell that was the final curtain call.
Well, he left visual clues, didn't he? Musical clues for people to figure out. I loved that. I thought that was great.
It goes. When I saw that last video clip of David Bowie, it reminded me of Queen. When Freddie Mercury did that last video shoot, it was just, you knew he didn't have much time remaining.
Freddie looked, I remember very clearly that final Queen video. Freddie looked really ill and very thin and very sad. And Bowie, he could still do it, but he had obviously been through cancer treatment, which made him look a certain way. I really admired what he did. You know, Tony Visconti, who was his producer, did the foreword to Woody's book. He talked in detail about how he and Woody had been touring in a band and playing the Ziggy songs. And they called Bowie on his mobile from the stage, you know, and wished him a happy birthday, which I thought was amazing, not long before he died. So you've got all these incredible stories. I mean, I like to work with people, Jamie, who I'm interested in. So they don't have to be in a metal band, you know. They don't even have to be musicians. They don't have to be anything. As long as they're not politically obnoxious or something like that, then I'll really enjoy working with them. Not long after that, I did a book with David Vincent, who was in Morbid Angel. And David he's a Satanist, he has pagan beliefs and occult beliefs. And it was fascinating talking to him about that stuff, right? I'm not a religious man at all. So I'm neutral when it comes to any kind of spiritual stuff. But to hear him very kind of in a very educated, calm way talk through his beliefs and his rationale was the same as doing a book with David Ellefson, who is a very devout Christian. And to hear him talking about his very strong, Christian beliefs, to me, those are equally interesting. These are people who have formulated a worldview and have a view of life beyond everyday reality that is really interesting. Woody Woodmansey is a Scientologist. So we talked a bit about that. And again, it's easy for me because I don't have any religious background or any religious convictions of any kind. So I can sort of sit in the middle and learn from all these interesting points of view. So those are the things, as well as the artistic talents, that make people interesting to work with.
Now, before we end going back into the book and also working for a magazine, there's a magazine I want to mention is Bass Magazine. You've done some work on that as well.
Yeah, actually, it's Bass Player Magazine, and I'm the editor.
Yeah,
that's my day job, I guess. That's what I do, innovate.
I know Joe Dover said, Jamie, ask him, and he's got so many contacts with. But you mentioned something before I go into that. You were mentioning something that you don't just write books in just music and metal, and that you just write in general because that's your passion. I've been asked many years since I've done this show on radio or podcast, Jamie, why don't you write a book of all the people that you interviewed and the members that you met? And I'm saying, you need an encyclopedia. We're going to go back to the 90s or late 80s, early 90s to now, because for some people, I will give a little bit of a brief for the fans. When I was growing up as a child, it wasn't a very great childhood. I was brought up with domestic violence in my household, and I became what they call a child husband because my father was an alcoholic. And I had to protect my mother for all the beatings and that. And when I did get my mum into a safe haven, so to speak, all I wanted to do was listen to music or play sport. That was it. And that's how I started to get introduced to a lot of the heavier side. And that's when my mum decided to see a change in me, that my attitude and anger was coming out because I was hurt. I felt like I was abandoned and all that. But yeah, many people said, Jamie, why don't you write a book? I can talk about it, but I can't write it. I'll just get a writer's block. Do you ever have that problem in your life, having that writer's block? Like you be on a project with whatever reason it is, you just get a writer's block?
No, I've never experienced that, but that's because I write nonfiction. I can imagine if I were writing some fantasy fiction or something like that, then I might well get stuck, And what you're talking about when you were talking about your past there, I have noted with quite a few people that I've worked with who had difficult childhoods that's incredibly difficult to talk about. And I'm not surprised that it would be very hard to write about. It's hard to process this stuff and go through it. And quite a few people I've done books with have been through this, right? The next book is the autobiography of Frank Bello, the bass player with Anthrax, and there's a lot of that in there. That's coming out either late this year or one after, or early in 2022. And it's difficult about traumatic events like that for obvious reasons. But it's important to do so because it's therapeutic to do so. You might well find that writing a book about your experience would be a form of therapy for you. And indeed, a lot of these people do. A lot of people who've experienced similar things. As for writer's block, no. If I were telling my own story, I'm sure I would find. I haven't had a bad life. I've always had a fairly easy life, fortunately. So I can't imagine I would find any areas too tricky to write about. But everyone in life has been through bereavements. Everyone's been through their fair share of trauma. Those things are never easy to write about. But like I said before, I think it's a valuable exercise to do so because it's a form of therapy.
And not only that, and I'm open to talk about this too. I was in rehab for drug abuse by the age of 20. I was in rehab. I took everything except for cocaine. I took heroin. I took methamphetamine, ecstasy, you name it. I was in rehab by the age of 20. By the age of 22, I was out of rehab. But while I was doing the 12 step programs, I was meeting some of these iconic Australian artists who performed in big bands like Angry Anderson, who was in the band Road Tattoo and he's still touring. He's a recovering alcoholic. Same with Jimmy Barnes, who's in Cold Chisel. He's a recovering alcoholic. I've met these people, even though I listened to their music beforehand, I met these people in the 12 step program and they just took me under their shadow and gave me some advice.
It's good.
For me now, the best thing is, I mean, I don't do a 12 step program now, but I'm dual clean. I'm over 20 odd years clean of narcotic drugs.
That's amazing.
Music, thank you. Music for me is my medication. And but if I got those two, I'm healthy. Because you mentioned before with Dave Ellison how he was a drug addict, or the band themselves were addicts themselves. But David Ellison went on a path of a different realm. He went into the spirituality side of things, and it's awesome for him. The same thing happened with Black Sabbath's Tommy and Monty. They had their drugs and alcohol with Black Sabbath as well. Tommy and Monty became a Christian and also a leader of a church. He became a pastor, or that's what we call him here in Australia, pastor. But
are we talking about Tony Iommi, the guitar player?
Yeah, Tommy and Monty. Yeah.
No, I don't think your information's right there. He didn't become addicted, and he didn't.
No. I didn't mention that. I didn't say that he became. The band was addictive. The members, like.
It was just Ozzy and Bill, really. Geezer. So let's run through this while we're talking about it. Ozzy has been in rehab on and off throughout his life, but he's mostly sober, I think. Iommi had a few problems with coke that he talked about, but he came through those. Geezer Butler was a drinker, but he gave up drinking in, I think, the 90s. And Bill Ward, the drummer, he was a very serious alcoholic, and it took him a long time to come through it, but he did, and he's now got something like 35 years sober. So that was the situation with them. David Ellison, he had been a devout Christian when he was a kid. So for him, it was a case of going back to the religion that he'd had when he was a child, which he did, and it provided the structure that he needed. I think, whatever your saving grace may be, if you've been through addiction, it's important that it provides some form of structure for you, because if you're I'm not an addict, and neither am I a therapist, so I'm speaking from a layman's point of view. But what I have noticed from working with people, and then there's been a few of them, right? So David gave up heroin, Max Cavalera was addicted to alcohol. He gave that up. Woody Woodmansey stopped drinking. Glenn Matlock stopped drinking. There must be other people that I'm thinking of who gave up a substance or another. If you're feeling a psychological gap or void with some substance, which a lot of people do, and there's no shame in this, then when that goes away, then you need to have something to hold on to that gives you strength to continue, structure in your life. And you know this, of course, because of what you've just told me. And so when I'm working with people on their life stories, quite often we have this kind of conversation, like the one that we're having now, where we talk about what it is. And it can be sport, it can be music. It often is music, in fact. And this leads me to another point that I always think is interesting. It might resonate with you. A lot of boys whose fathers either abandon them or are not there because they die. It's not their fault, they just didn't live, who have to grow up without a father. It is theorized, not proven, but theorized, that they gravitate towards heavy metal for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a kind of a gang mentality, and it's a tribe, and it's a family. But secondly, and relevantly in the case of men, is that it's a source of testosterone, which they won't get at home because there's no father around. So it's a place to let off steam in a primarily masculine environment. And there's tons of psychology in this. And it's the research into that psychology is ongoing. So once again, I'm not speaking from a place of expertise. I'm speaking from a place of experience where I've witnessed this and worked with people who very much adhere to this view that music, and specifically metal, saved them from a situation that was very distressing. And that's again one of the reasons why people are interesting, who've been through this stuff and have an interesting story to tell.
Now, another one band that really did help me through my addiction was a band called Striper, and I've met Striper, and what they went through. I mean, they almost became broke after that. That album that they don't really recommend when they change it from yellow and black to black and blue.
Yeah, I interviewed one of them. I think I interviewed is his name Robert Sweet? I interviewed one of them for the Metallica book, because they were, much as people laugh at Striper, the Christian rock band, for those who don't know, for being sort of Hollywood and ridiculous and throwing Bibles into the crowd and all that stuff. The early music that they made, if you take any of these bands' first record, whether it's Motley Crue, Rat, Poison, Cinderella, all these supposedly cheesy hair bands, the first record or the second record that they made in almost every case is pretty much like Judas Priest. It's just regular 80s heavy metal, right? It's not thrash metal, it's not glam metal, it's just metal, and it's entertaining as hell. Anyway, I interrupted you. Sorry, you were talking about them. But anyway, I interviewed one of them for my Metallica book.
Yeah, and Odd Fox is currently going through medical treatment. He's got brain tumors. And I just want to say to the fans out there, the GoFundMe fundraiser for Odd Fox has been achieved. The goal was to get to 50,000. They achieved that, plus more some. They got the money. So thanks to everyone that had that, and we just hope that Odd Fox does come through it, because there is a possibility that he may lose hearing in his ear from the surgery. And that, so
we're getting to the point in life where a lot of these dudes are reaching an age where these serious medical conditions occur. It's weird, isn't it? I very clearly remember being 21 and listening to all this stuff, and then here we are 30 years later, and these are old men in some cases.
Well, before I ask you a question that Jay just sent me a text. So you've got to ask this question to Joe. The question I want to ask you: do you see obviously you do see the change in the music business, but with the bands that we all grew up with, like Metallica, Iron Maiden, and all that. So now, when a young band starting out now, they will never get the same recognition and the thing that the band did back then.
Yeah, it's unlikely.
The record companies back then were pumping money into these bands to get them where they are. What do you see, especially in the UK? Because if you can make it in the UK, you can just go across the pond to the US and start another place there. But for you being in the UK, do you see the change growing? Oh, I know.
Oh my God! Yeah. No. I've witnessed it in real time over the last 20 years in the industry.
Yeah.
Essentially, the big bands. If you're in a big band now, you've made it. You're fine.
Yeah.
The huge bands aren't going anywhere, right? Kiss are on their farewell tour, obviously. But if you're Metallica, you've probably got 10 years. If you're the Foo Fighters, you've probably got 15, 20 years. Who knows? So those bands are fine. We'll be listening to them for years and years and years. Only death will stop them, and death will inevitably stop quite a lot of them. But the bands will keep going as an entity, and the music will still be there, and their presence will be huge. Look at Motorhead, man. They release a new record every month or whatever it is, or every year at the moment. Nothing's stopping them, even though Lemmy's long gone. The problem is this. You and I and millions of people like us would regularly spend something like £15 or 25 Aussie dollars on a CD, right? Or a video or a DVD or a box set or something like that. We would do that, or as much as we possibly could. So that huge amount of money that plunged into these record companies' pockets every single day for 40 years, right?
Yeah.
That's why they could spend. I was talking to Des Fafara of Devil Driver the other day. He was telling me that the last Coal Chamber video they did cost $300,000, right? And that's for a video, for a single. You know what I mean? And that's and that was in the 90s, late 90s or whatever, early 2000s, when sales were at a peak, income was at a peak. Now, I started as a journalist at that exact point, late 90s. And there was so much money, it was ridiculous. They had so much cash, and all of it was coming out of my pocket and your pocket and Jay's pocket and everybody's pocket, right? Because that was what we thought you had to do. If you wanted to get music, the only way you could do it was to buy a piece of plastic that had it on it. That piece of plastic cost 1 cent to make, right? And yet we paid, well, like I said, $20, £15. Now, once all that went away, and it inevitably did go away, because as soon as you had three things, recordable media, a broadband connection, and rippable CDs, right, or whatever you called it. You remember back in the day, it was called ripping the contents of the CD to your hard drive, right? And then some distribution network, on or offline. Once you had all those things, then inevitably all that income was going to go away. So what's happened is that the big bands are absolutely fine. They make money out of touring. They still do. Gene Simmons can charge $100 for a ticket. Everyone will happily pay it, right? So can Metallica, so can the Foo Fighters, so can Slipknot. The problem is if you're in a medium-sized band or a small band or a new band, in that case, the record companies don't have that giant flow of money from us anymore, do they? So they can't give a medium-sized band the tour support that it needs, or the budget that it needs to record a record, or money for videos, or whatever. The money's still there, it's just way reduced. You know, they've got a fraction of what they used to have. So that means that they're much more risk averse. You know, why would they give money to a brand new band that would fail? Whereas back in the day, you could sign a new band and develop them, you know, give them 3 or 4 albums to get good, because the money was there to do that. And if you lost all that money, it didn't matter, right? There was another $1 million coming in that next weekend from record sales. So that's what's happened. Nowadays, it kills me. I run a couple of web pages, not least for Bass Player magazine. And, you know, the importance that is attached to getting multiple likes and clicks and hits and engagement, and the analytics, the Google Analytics, and the other metrics that we use to measure online engagement, they're all important, aren't they? Because that's where people spend so much time. And none of that is why any of us signed up for this job. You know, all we want to do, and I may or may not be speaking for you, but I think I probably am, is go to the gigs, have a beer, listen to the music, meet the musicians, have some fun, and have a good time, right? We didn't want to sit in front of a computer all day long, did we? Right? That wasn't the idea. And yet that is what we're doing. And increasingly, it's what musicians are doing too. Certainly in this 1 year or 2 year period when we're in a pandemic, that is all everybody's doing. Hopefully, people will be able to go out and tour again, and that's another conversation. But there still won't be much money for them to do it. The only way for them to make money is to charge increasing amounts of money for merchandise and for ticket sales. And as long as people like you and me are happy to pay those sums, then that's fine. But it's a tenuous model, you know, because it relies on people saying, yes, I will pay $120 to see the Foo Fighters tonight. Who knows if that will continue? I hope it does, but who knows if it will.
And some people will fork out the extra bucks to get the meet and greets as well, on top of the tickets as well, to meet their band as well. I
think Metallica's last meet tour, when they came through the UK in whenever it was, 2018, I think the meet and greet cost was, I could be wrong, but I think it was like £2,000 or £1,900 or something. Fucking huge amount of money to go and shake their hands. And I get it. You know, if I was that much of a fan and if I had that much money spare, I'd probably do it as well. But I don't know.
Well, speaking of the meet and greet, do you really think they will come back in full swing after the pandemic, or do you think meet and greets will be gone now due to the pandemic?
Well, again, I'm not speaking as an expert, but what I predict is that coronavirus will always be with us now in some form, just as the regular winter influenza is, right? So the conversation is going to be, how much of a risk are we happy to live with? Just as we live with many, many thousands of deaths every year from flu, regular flu. Right. Now we're also going to have to, how many coronavirus deaths are we going to be happy to live with? And the answer is a certain number. Now the question is, what is that number? So when that has been decided, then it will be understood how many live events you can have, whether everyone wears a mask, whether everyone's socially distanced, all these things that we hear about every single day on the news that we probably don't need to go into too deeply because we don't have any data, do we?
No.
So yeah, it'll come back. Everything will come back. The question is when. That's my view.
Before I ask this Jay double question, I've got to ask it.
Say hi to Jay for me, by the way. I meet Jay every now and then at gigs, and he's a great guy.
I will. You mentioned about the music as well. I know here in Australia, I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to the mainstream radio stations because there's a lot of Australian bands do not get the recognition that they deserve. We're talking of bands like Airborne, who had to relocate overseas to get and Airborne are massive overseas compared back here in Australia. In the early days, ACDC went back to the UK, and they got big overseas before they came back to. Same as the Easy Beats, they went overseas and became big.
In excess got big in America and the UK before, or much more big than in Australia. I'm thinking.
Yeah,
that could be a bad example.
I remember when the Skyhooks first went to America. America didn't really like them, so they came back home. But that's what I'm getting at. Now, for a new band in the last over 20 years here in Australia, released an album or a single, the mainstream media predominantly will not pick it up. The independent radio stations here in Australia will. That's the question I want to ask you. Have you seen this coming to the UK? Like, have you heard much of Australian music in the last 20 years?
Not really. I mean, the problem is that you guys have an incredibly rich music scene and an incredibly wide culturally vivid scene, but you suffer from this massive geographical disadvantage, which is that you're just so far away from the centers of culture, which are LA, New York, and London, that it's deprioritized, right? So what I am surprised to hear is that Australian media is not supporting its own music, right? That is really weird, because Australia is huge with lots of very talented people and lots of great big cities that are full of great music. So that's no, I have to say I haven't really heard much Aussie music. Airborne, I have been exposed to. I met those guys a couple of times at various awards ceremonies. They're hilarious, aren't they? The music's great. I'm trying to think. Do you know, I remember I was in Australia a couple of years ago, and I was in Australia 20 years ago. And on both occasions, I met people who just talked about your band Spiderbait, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a big band, but they always went on about Spiderbait. Go listen to Spiderbait. Go listen to Spiderbait. And I still haven't, right? I guess I will have to at some point. You recommend them?
I will, but they're not as big as what they were back 20 years ago. They're more like a cult. I mean, yeah, they still tour, they still make music, but what I'm saying, if you want to listen to the mainstream radio, they hardly play Spiderbait on the radio anymore. I mean,
see, that's unusual. That is unusual. I mean, look, I will say that, you know, I put Cliff Williams on the cover of Bass Player 3-4 issues ago because that album that AC/DC did was massive. I mean, that was a worldwide hit. So you can take comfort in knowing that, you know, all right, smaller Aussie bands may not penetrate overseas, or rather they have to go overseas to penetrate. But you do have pretty much the biggest rock band in the world, you know, so something to be pleased with there.
Well, that's a question I've been asked. Do I consider AC/DC Australian band or international band? I said both. They spend more time overseas than they do in Australia. But
Cliff's English, right? Brian's English. Angus is Scottish, right? Born in Scotland?
Yes.
Is Phil Rudd Australian?
Phil Rudd is New Zealander.
And Stevie Young is what? What is he, an Aussie? He must be an Aussie.
Oh, geez, Stevie Young, he's the nephew of Malcolm.
Yeah. So I'm assuming he was born in Australia.
I think so, yeah.
So you got 20%. It's 20% Australian then.
Yeah. I think the only Australian is the bass player, isn't it?
No, Cliff's English.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah, but all migrated. But see, when it comes to Bon Scott, even though he was born in your neck of the woods, we still clarify him as our own because he's buried in Fremantle in Western Australia. So
they immigrated into Australia, right? And they lived in Australia. Yeah. I think you can probably claim them as Aussies.
Yeah. Well, anyone that comes from New Zealand would claim them as their own. Like how many bands came out of New Zealand, like Crowder's House and a band called Greg, and they came from New Zealand. We claim their own.
There is a cool Aussie band, Kiwi band called is it called Alien Weaponry?
Yes, yes.
That's a decent band.
Yes. And it just goes to show that Australia just have this weird sense of humour. No, we'll take it. Yep, you're ours. We'll take it. and we eat Vegemite on toast. So
my wife has a ton of relatives. My wife has family in Sydney and Brisbane, and we visited them 2 years ago. And yeah, it's a great place. I love your country. I think it's fantastic.
Now, Jay said that you guys met at the Crowbar. Now, apparently the Crowbar is closed now. There's a bit of a rumour going around that it may open. Can you talk about that venue? Because that's where you and Jay Dubber met.
If it's the event I'm thinking of, it was the launch of one of my books. So either the Cliff Burton book or the Machine Head book. I had launches at the Crowbar for both of those books, which I think would have been something like 2011 and 2012. So it's ages ago. And so I definitely would have met Jay at one of those. And I met him also at a gig. I don't know who it was. Maybe it was a Slayer gig or something a couple of years later in London. The Crowbar, I don't have any information, but the owner, whose name is Richard, is on Facebook and is promoting the Crowbar brand. So I think there's going to be a new one. The only reason it's shut, I think, is because of coronavirus. You know, like so many of these places close. And I think a documentary has just been made about it, actually, which people can check out. But it's for those who don't know who are watching this, the Crowbar is this great little heavy metal bar in the middle of London. And, you know, you go, I took David Vincent there when he was over with Morbid Angel. I've been there with many, many musicians. And it's so much fun. It's always populated by all the old school journalists from the Kerrang days. And a lot of these places, a lot of cities have a place like this. In New York, there's a place called Duff's, which is absolutely amazing. I don't know if you've been there, but if you ever get the chance to go to Duff's, it's in Brooklyn. It's hilarious. It's just like the Crowbar, a little kind of underground, divey kind of place with the best possible music, really, really sweet people. And while we're talking about cool places to visit, I really want to big up Utopia Records in Sydney, where I went 2 years ago. I loved that place. It was hilarious. So we had a family holiday in Sydney in the summer of 2019, in Australia in 2019. We went all over. And we had this hotel in Sydney. And I went out one night just to get some booze. I had to find a bottle shop. And it turned out that our apartment was literally next to Utopia Records, which I'd never heard of. This is terrible. I'd never even heard of it. So I thought, this looks interesting. And I went in. First thing I saw as I walked in was the bookshelf, right? And oh my God, it had 10 books by me on the bookshelf. I don't know any bookshops in England that have 10 books by me. You know? And so I went up to them and said, "Oh, hi, you've got a load of my books on the bookshelf." And they went, "Oh my God, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm Joel McIver." And they were really pleased to see me. Did a photo shoot, took my kids the next day, and we bought a load of stuff. And that is a unique place. You know, anybody who visits Sydney should go because you've got every record under the sun, every bit of merch, huge T-shirt store. Those guys really are very passionate, aren't they, about what they do? So yeah, I really love that place. So if they're watching this, you know, respect.
And I'm going to give a shout out for you to the Utopia Records. You're in Sydney, down at George Street. Go there. There's not many record stores around the world anymore.
Yeah.
This one is A+, top notch. You get
it really is.
Stuff.
It really is. Really nice people.
But going back to venues, I believe the Cavern in Liverpool is getting closed down, or has already been closed, where the Beatles used to play.
I have no idea. I mean, the original Cavern Club closed decades ago. The one that's been around for since then is a replica in a different location, I think. I couldn't tell you what its current status is.
Funny you say that. Here in Adelaide, where I am, we did have a Cavern bar similar to what you guys got. That closed down a few years ago here in Adelaide because when Beatles came here for the first time ever, Adelaide was just completely Beatlemania.
Yeah.
And they had a bar dedicated to the Beatles, so that's gone. And there's a lot
funny,
of
you know, because I'm the editor of Bass Player magazine, I get to meet a lot of bass players, right? So, you know, I've interviewed Sting and I've interviewed, you know, all of them. Gene Simmons, like hundreds of times. And but I've never yet met Paul McCartney, right? And every couple of months I drop a message to his press person saying, "Come on, let's do an interview for Bass Player magazine." And it's, the conversation's always positive, but we just haven't done it yet. And I really want to do it. But about 10 years ago, I was in Air Studios in London, and I was, what I was doing? I was either listening to a Stephen Wilson playback or an Opeth playback, right? In surround sound. It's a really cool experience. You go and sit down with the band, right, and you listen to their stuff. Anyway, I went to the canteen to get a cup of tea, and who's sitting in the corner but Paul McCartney, right? Just a little table on his own, and he's reading the newspaper and drinking a coffee, and he has that kind of like, please leave me alone vibe about him. And you know how, you don't want to be a dick, right? And annoy people when he's just having his break. He's probably been recording something. So I just stood in the queue for a minute. We kind of looked at each other, just our eyes met across the canteen. And I thought, I should really just go and shake his hand, for Christ's sake, and say, look, I've been a huge fan of your band forever, and I'm also the editor of Bass Player. But I didn't. I thought my head overruled my heart, so I left him in peace. But if I find that he dies before I've got a chance to interview him, I'm going to be pissed off with myself for not taking the chance to at least go and shake his hand. And not that he's likely to die, but he's of a certain age, and anyway, thought I'd share that with you.
Before we talk about your work with Bass Player magazine, I'm a drummer. I've been a drummer, and one of my favorite drummers, and you know this guy, Rick Allen from Def Leppard. Yeah. I always wanted to interview him because he had a story.
Absolutely.
And not only that, my mum's been a nurse for 38 years, and she worked with those type of traumatic people losing a limb and whatnot. Yeah. But you being a writer and also a publisher for the Bass Player magazine.
No, I'm not a publisher. I'm the editor.
Oh, no. You get what I'm saying, yeah. How did that start? And also, how many stories can you tell? I mean, you said that you met Paul McCartney. You interviewed Gene Simmons. I'm a Gene Simmons freak. I love Gene Simmons. I love to have him on the show. Unfortunately, due to some other stuff that I've been told by the management, we can't get him on. But what other stories can you talk about that magazine? Because you've interviewed so many bands and you've written books about, but is there anything that really stands out the top of you?
Yeah, I've got a few stories like that. So I've been, like I said, I was on Record Collector magazine in my earlier career. So in 2005, my Metallica book was a bestseller. So I jacked in my day job, which was fantastic because I had tons and tons of book deals to do. So and ever since then, I've been a freelance writer. So that's 16 years. Pretty soon into my freelance career, I continued to be a magazine writer as well. I continued to write the odd thing for Record Collector. I started writing for what was called Bass Guitar magazine at the time, the English-based magazine. Bass Player was an American mag, and that was the archetype, like the amazing bass magazine that we all aspired to. So I ran Bass Guitar. I became the editor of Bass Guitar magazine, that's what I should say, in 2012, so 9 years ago. While writing books, while writing for Metal Hammer, while doing all this stuff, doing a million things. And then in 2018, the publisher of Bass Guitar magazine over here acquired Bass Player magazine, their American mag. So now I was editing a British magazine and an American magazine, identical content but different titles. So again, I've been writing books, I've been doing journalism, but since for the last 9 years, I've had a sort of day job as well as a magazine editor. And then last year we decided to merge Bass Guitar and Bass Player. So now we have Bass Player UK and Bass Player US. So that's the situation with editing the magazine. So I'm lucky enough to be in the position of editing this incredibly respected magazine. It's got serious heritage. It was the first issue came out, the first regular issue came out in 1990 with Billy Sheehan on the cover. And we just did a 30th anniversary issue last year, also with Billy on the cover, holding issue number 1, which was cool. So along the way, there have been other magazines that are about bass, and a lot of them have fallen away. There are a couple of really good ones still that whose editorial stuff I know and I like and we get on well with. But bass player is really the big one, the big fish in a sort of fairly small pond of bass guitar, right?
Yeah.
And so as a result, because there aren't too many places where the really big bass players can go, I'm fairly inundated with requests for people to be on the mat and be on the cover. So Sting was a no-brainer. It was wonderful interviewing him because I've always liked the Police, you know, and you know, a guy like that just transcends playing an instrument. You know, he's a you know,
Right.
got the stuff he's done would fill 10 podcasts. Gene, if you want to talk about Gene, he is a really, really interesting guy. I guess I've interviewed him like 5 times. For this magazine, for other magazines, for books, and I've seen both sides of Gene, right? So the kind of like combative side, where he's not trying to piss you off, but he's very, very happy to open his mouth and make controversial statements. You know, I've seen that side of Gene many, many times, and it's part of the fun, isn't it? It's what you expect from the demon. You know, it's not offensive; it's hilarious. You know, and then lately though, and this will interest you. As you know, what is he, 72 now? Kiss are on their final tour. He's mellowed out. He's much more mellow. The last time I spoke to him was the week of Eddie Van Halen's death, which is what, 3 or 4 months ago. And he was really, really quiet and reflective and pensive. And we talked a lot about some deep stuff. We talked about his, you know, he's grown up without a father. We talked a lot about that. So anyway, I've always had a good time with Gene.
Jane had changed a lot since being married to Shannon Tweed. And a lot of people have been put off by that. A lot of people, because the best Gene Simmons for me was when he was around the Revenge of Life 3 era. He had the goatee, he wore the black leathers and the long hair. That image stood for him without the makeup. When they took the makeup off back in 83, Gene Simmons was the only member of Kiss that didn't felt comfortable without the makeup. And he was trying to find a persona of himself. And it was around about Crazy Nights era he started to get comfortable. But before that, like Lick It Up, Animalized, Asylum, Gene Simmons was not comfortable on stage, even though he did do some movies in the 80s and that. But while he was on stage, his persona without that makeup, he was not comfortable. He's even said this himself. But you're right, Gene Simmons has mellowed a lot. He's lost a lot of weight over the last few years, and he had changed. I think Shannon had basically put Gene's feet back on solid ground because he was not that type of bloke 20, 30 years ago, Gene. Gene was not that. Gene was a guy that he didn't give a crap about anything. But now he's well spoken, he's mellowed, and he will say his piece, of course. Gene will say his piece, but he's not that. What he will say, he's not that arsehole anymore. He's not.
Well, none of us are, Jamie.
Yeah. But going back to Dave Ellefson, I believe he's doing a new book. I want to ask, are you part of that new book with Dave Ellefson?
No, he's done a bunch of books, actually. So Dave's done, he did a book in the 90s, like a business book, which was cool. He did that on his own. And then he and I did his first autobiography, which was called My Life with Death in 2013. That was really good. He did a second book called More Life with Death with a writer called Tom Hazert, who is also in his band. That came out, I think, 2 years ago. I was really busy with Bass Player magazine. Initially, he and I were going to do that together, but I just didn't have the time. So I was really glad when he connected with Tom, and they did a really good job on that. Yeah. Now, David has a fiction book out, which I haven't read, but looks like a lot of fun. And he also has a film out. He's got a film company. So he just put a horror film out called Dwellers. And not only that, he's got a coffee company. He runs, I think it's Combat, the record label. I think he might have a booking agency. He's also the manager of a really cool band called Dollskin. So what David has done is, in parallel with being in Megadeth, is build his own empire under the, I think it's EMP, which I think is Ellefson Music Production. So he's got so much going on. And, you know, he is the kind of guy that I would like to be in so many ways. He's a really good friend to me. an incredible talent. He's very, very professional, but very, very friendly. He's nice to people. Usually you're very professional and very busy and not nice to people, or you're very relaxed, you don't have much to do, and you're nice to people. You know what I mean? He's both. He's a good lad. I've got a lot of time for David, and everything he does is great.
Well, that's something I need to share. My wonderful fiance is a freelance photographer, where bands come and she's done a lot of gigs here. More importantly, with Australia, there's not many magazines here that can be that public. Like there are some magazines like Heavy Mag that does hard rock and metal and that, but the
got
other
Rolling
ones
Stone, haven't you? Rolling Stone Australia, you still got?
Oh, I haven't seen it. I think
Maybe not.
I think Rolling Stone magazine's still there. But what
I did an interview for the Aussie Rolling Stone about 10 years ago. I interviewed Guy Ritchie, you know, the film director.
Yes, Guy Ritchie, yeah. But what I'm saying is, it's so different here in Australia. Many think, yeah, we're great and wonderful. We've got a lot of great bands here, and that. It's not the case. So the Australian music industry, it's a rock and a hard place. Yes, it is. We've got bands here. Yes, that's always going to be. But to get that exposure, to try to get it into, right, it's a lot harder now than what it was in the early days.
Very difficult. And if your fiancée is a photographer, I'm sure she's finding it much harder to be paid than she used to be. That's the case with rock photography in general, because people, I mean, that is a difficult position to be in. You know, I know a bunch of photographers, and not only are their pictures routinely used without credit, they're spread all over the internet. You know, they never get a mention. That's a very difficult gig to have.
It does. And like I said this also, I don't take anything for granted for everything that I've done on the podcast world, or even my partner, what she's done. Yes, we've been given extra tickets and that, but we've always paid a ticket up front before we even get these other tickets from the magazines that we work for. So with people asking, Jamie, on your big note, no, I'm not big noting. I've worked so damn hard in what I've done, and I take everything as a privilege and an honor, and I don't take anything for granted, because when I start to become my own critic, that's when it becomes a problem, because I've always been taught when I was in radio, it was from the executive director. She said, people will say bad things about you, Jamie. People will say great things about you. But the most important thing is, do not become your own critic. That's where the problem lies. And
yeah, I think so. Keep your feet on the ground, you know, keep your loved ones close. Don't believe the good things or the bad things that people say about you, you know. Exactly. I look at Amazon. I think I've got 32 books out. 33 is coming soon. And then 34, 35, 36 are all coming out in the next 2 years. In the early days, believe me, I used to go through my reviews on Amazon and take them seriously and read them. Oh my God, you know, oh yeah. Believe me, if from the emails that I get and the social media messages that I get, I think probably I'm about reviewed 90% positively and 10% negatively, and I'll totally take that. That's good enough, you know. What's important to me, and this I'll need to finish off if you don't mind, but what's important to me at this point really is continuing to do a good job, maintaining relationships, looking after my family, and that's really it, man. You know, there's not much else to life, I don't think.
No. Well, just a couple of questions and we'll wrap it up, and I want to give Joel a very farewell after the show, a proper farewell. But a couple of questions I want to ask you. When I sit back and listen to my own interviews, I know I've done a great, hard, and good type of thing. Do you always pat yourself on the back when you say, yeah, thank you? And I know you're humble. But when you look back at your work and the interviews that you've conducted and the books you've written, you look back and say, geez, that is such great. You also mentioned that you could have done a little bit better or a little bit more. Everyone does that. Everybody says that. But when you look at your own work, you proud of what you've done?
Yeah, I am. There's a significant bibliography now. That's a lot of books, a lot of journalism. I feel that there's been a progression, right? So after 20, 25 years of doing this, I feel like I'm doing my best work. But what that implies is that my early stuff was not my best work, you know. So I'll look back at my first couple of books and say to myself, That is the work of a younger man who didn't have that much experience. So it's not terrible. It's just not as good as it would be now. So I don't beat myself up. I forgive myself for that. Nobody is at peak form at the start of their careers. Pride, do I feel proud? I feel content. I think contentment is important. I feel that my kids will be proud of what I've done, after I'm gone, which is important to me. And I've made a lot of good friends in this industry, which is important to me too. It's interesting, when you first asked that question and you said, when you listen back to the interviews you've done, I thought you were going to say, do you think you're a good interviewer? And my answer to that was going to be, I'll often listen back and I wish I wasn't interrupting people as much as I did. People were trying to talk, and I would say, yeah, but don't you think this? And hey, what about this? So in that specific sense, I need to shut up a bit more when I interview people. But no, generally the body of work, I'm very pleased with it, Jamie.
Yeah. And lastly, before we wrap it up, if you ever had a dream now, or you're still living the dream, I should say, you're still living the dream. But if there's a chance to interview or write for someone that you haven't yet done, who would you like that person to be and why?
You know what? It probably wouldn't be a musician, Jamie.
Okay.
I'd quite like to interview. There are a few politicians, authors, playwrights, artists, actors, directors, all the obvious people that would be very interesting. I wish I could have interviewed Prince before he died. That would have been good.
Yeah.
Never got close. Probably could have happened now, funnily enough, because I'm editing Bass Player magazine, and that magazine interviewed Prince at Minneapolis, Paisley Park a whole bunch of times. Other than that, I think I've interviewed all the musicians I really want to interview. Like I said, Paul McCartney, he's still on the bucket list. So him definitely is the answer to your question. Other than that, it's just a pleasure to revisit people, So to interview someone a second or a third or a fourth time, there are lots of very good people in this industry. That's the goal, really, just to keep on keeping standards high and keep on enjoying myself.
Yes. I've got so many bucket list people I want to interview, and I know in the music business you've got to jump through a lot of hoops because there's a lot of PR people and there's a lot of management behind the scenes. And here in Australia, I will say this to the fans, here in Australia, you've got to understand, yes, we do get some big artists on the show, but more importantly, I'm not going to get every one of them. You guys been giving me requests and that. Yes, I understand and I love and appreciate it. But with the music, the way things is especially for podcasting, you're not going to get everyone. For some reason, shape or another, you're not going to get everyone because here in Australia, it's a little bit different than what it is overseas. And but I appreciate those requests that I've been getting. I'm still living those dreams since I was 10 years old to get these interviews happening. But this one here, I reckon it was well done. I've listened to so many feedback from you, the questions that I've answered, and the stories are just phenomenal, Joel. I want to thank you so much for participating in this interview.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, Jamie. Thank you so much for having me on, and keep up the good work.
I will. Guys, stay safe. That's all I can say. Stay safe. We'll get through this together. Live one day at a time. And we'll join you next time on the Rock-A-Day. Joel, stay with us. I'll give you a farewell.